As folks are joining, I know we're a few minutes live, but as folks are coming in, we'll go over the housekeeping items before we jump into the content. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides as well as recordings will be posted on ACL.gov/OAArule in the coming weeks. The chat feature is disabled. However, the Q&A feature is available for folks to leave questions. We'll do our best to respond to your questions live, or we'll take them back for further consideration. So be sure to put any questions that you have in the Q&A function. We are not able to provide enough time. We have a lot of content today. We don't have enough time to take questions verbally. So don't raise your hand, but instead go into the Q&A function, and thank you for that. Additionally, CART services are available, as well as ASL or interpretation services. Along the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can select captions for CART, or you can select interpretation for ASL. And so we have both of those options available to support your participation today. And I believe I just wanted to do a double check because we were working on this right up until the beginning of our webinar, and it looks like both interpretation and captions are available. So if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to introduce myself and again welcome you all to the webinar today. My name is Carrie Benson. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Aging here at ACL with the Administration on Aging. I am a 50-year-old white woman with short brown hair and glasses. I am wearing a green suit coat and black shirt underneath. Welcome to our 6th webinar in the Back to Basics webinar series as part of ACL's rollout of the updated 2024 Older Americans Act regulations, also known as the Act or the OAA regulations. We have been hearing from many of you that you are eager to hear the details regarding the new OAA rule, and we hope you found the webinars we've done to date helpful. And I am beyond delighted to share that today's webinar will cover many details related to contracts and commercial relationships. We can go to the next slide. In today's webinar, we will look at a sample State Unit on Aging policy and form for prior approval of Section 212 agreements. We'll also cover sub-regulatory guidance on contracts and commercial relationships and answer key frequently asked questions. We'll review selected rule provisions, especially those that are applicable to Title III programs regarding contracts and commercial relationships. And finally, we'll summarize key points and provide links to additional resources. So if we go to the next slide, I just wanted to pause before we do dive into the details to provide a little bit more context for today's webinar. So if we can go to the next slide, I'd first like to share some background on our Back to Basics webinars. As we've reviewed in our prior webinars, what we mean by Back to Basics is how do we effectively meet the mission and the vision of the Older Americans Act through a holistic program management strategy or approach. Our view is that this is a holistic approach that includes program, fiscal, data, evaluation, training, communications, policies, and procedures that you should have in place. And it's important that all of this is in alignment to create the holistic program management strategy. By doing so, we maintain the integrity of our advocacy activities as well as provide targeted, effective, and efficient activities throughout the aging network at the state and local levels. In terms of why we are talking about this now, and we mentioned this in prior webinars as well, we're doing this Back to Basics series because we felt it was perfect timing to have it coincide with the first comprehensive update to the Older Americans Act program regulations since 1988. That's 36 years. It's also that we learned so much from the COVID-19 pandemic, and we wanted to incorporate those components in future programming, ensuring that flexibilities are there, but that the right amount of stewardship and oversight is also there. We have also heard about a large number of retirements of people with incredible levels of institutional knowledge of our programs. For example, maybe your key budget person left, or your key program person has retired. We want to restore the knowledge of these program administration expectations and give you all the foundational components. We also see somewhat of an increased interest in the overall stewardship of public funds, and it's coming from all sectors. We are hearing inquiries from Congress. We're hearing inquiries from state auditors and from all quarters about this effective stewardship of funding. And so we want the Aging Services Network to continue to be effective in your stewardship of the public funds and effective in responding to these questions. We are also very aware of and excited by the fact that there are new and developing business opportunities as we have been focused on contracts and commercial relationships previously referred to as business acumen. Having the network develop these skills in order to expand services and supports to more older adults and family caregivers and truly partner with the healthcare sector and develop other relationships with them and other funders is critical. We want to ensure that you all have the basic components in place to operate in an effective and efficient way that will withstand anyone reviewing and asking about aging network programming. We are doing this webinar series for the entire aging network. While state units on aging are responsible for developing and maintaining policies and procedures for delivery of services under Titles 3 and 7 of the Act, they must do so in consultation with AAAs, program participants, and other appropriate parties in the state. Consultation with AAAs and other parts of the aging network should be a collaborative, proactive, and ongoing effort. We are hearing great examples across the country of state units on aging developing work groups with aging network participation, holding regular meetings with aging network leaders to talk through different aspects of rule implementation and other activities to recognize the vital local level involvement in aging services, policies, and programs that is a hallmark of the Older Americans Act. In particular, AAAs have a unique designation under federal law and responsibility to serve as a public advocate for the development or enhancement of comprehensive and coordinated community-based systems of services in each community throughout and specific to each planning and service area. For today's webinar on contracts and commercial relationships, we especially encourage state units on aging and AAAs to work together to develop streamlined policies and procedures to meet the requirements of the Act and expand the ability of the aging network to engage in business activities. So if we go to the next slide, it is my great honor to announce that earlier today, ACL posted its sub-regulatory guidance and sample policy and form to our website. You can go to the link on the slide, and we also just posted it in the Zoom platform for you to access and follow along as we go through it. We thank all of you who have provided comments and feedback to help us create the sub-regulatory guidance and sample policy and form to ensure business activities further the intended benefits of the Act and do not compromise core responsibilities or the statutory mission of state units on aging, AAAs, and service providers, as well as promote and expand the ability of the aging network to engage in business activities. And now I'm pleased to turn the presentation over to my colleague, Elliot Kennedy, Deputy Administrator for Policy and Evaluation at ACL.
Thank you very much, Carrie. As Carrie mentioned, I'm Elliot Kennedy, the Deputy Administrator for Policy and Evaluation at ACL. I'm a 38-year-old white man with brown hair and blue eyes. I'm wearing a blue suit jacket, a white shirt, and a maroon tie. And I'm very excited to join you today. Carrie, I want to echo your thanks to the Aging Network and to all who have provided great questions and helpful feedback for us in developing this sub-regulatory guidance. Many of the folks tuning into this webinar have been doing this work for more than a decade, including with the support from ACL through learning collaboratives, webinars, technical assistance materials, and more. We know the Aging Network is eager to understand how to properly meet the statutory requirements of the Older Americans Act regarding contracts and commercial relationships in a way that is streamlined and promotes the ability of aging networks to engage in these highly important business arrangements. ACL is pleased to issue this sub-regulatory guidance to show how to do that. Before I dive into the details, I'm going to start by giving some background information, and then I will review the sub-regulatory guidance and sample policy and form in detail. So on this slide, we talk about terminology, intent, some considerations, and oversight. When we talk about contracts and commercial relationships as a phrase, which we also refer to as agreements more generally, we are primarily talking about how to understand and implement Section 212 of the Older Americans Act. That corresponds to 1321.9 C214 of the final rule, contracts and commercial relationships. We use these terms interchangeably because it doesn't matter what you call the agreement. What matters is the underlying purpose or substance of the agreement. The Older Americans Act requires state units on aging and area agencies on aging to partner in supporting a comprehensive network of aging services in every state. We all know there is immense need for aging services, and the Act encourages AAAs to leverage non-Older Americans Act resources to further expand the availability of services for older adults. Section 212 of the Act provides statutory requirements, which we think of as the instructions and the guardrails for how to do this, related to accomplishing that expansion. You do that through contracts, commercial relationships, or agreements. Our goal in publishing guidance that is the topic of today's webinar is to make implementing Section 212 as easy as possible for SUAs and AAAs. As we'll talk about in this webinar, the guidance is comprised of two parts: an informational bulletin addressing frequently asked questions and providing some scenarios to help better understand Section 212, and a sample SUA policy and procedure, including a form for AAAs to submit to the SUA that helps illustrate how a state could operationalize the guidance. I'll say this now, I will underscore this a million times. States are not required to adopt the sample policy and form. States may feel free to adopt them if helpful. So one question that comes up a lot when we talk about Section 212, particularly the requirement to have pre-approval by the SUA in order to establish Section 212 agreements, is why. What is the connection between AAAs engaging in this work and the state's oversight responsibilities? Beyond the fact that it's a requirement in the Older Americans Act, the Act also lays out the governmental interests in the form of assurances and other requirements in oversight in this area. I won't list all of them here, but primarily, we all have a collective interest in ensuring that AAAs provide or facilitate services that are free of conflict of interest, that the federally designated aging services network stays strong, and that we have transparency and insight into the services that AAAs provide. And as a last piece of context, I just want to review the grantee relationship between ACL, State Units on Aging, and AAAs. As you know, ACL provides grant funding directly to State Units on Aging, so SUAs are our grantees. AAAs, by statute, receive a portion of that funding from the SUA. That means that AAAs are ACL subgrantees. The SUA is ultimately responsible for ensuring that Older Americans Act funding is spent consistent with federal requirements, and for sharing any required information back with ACL. That includes ensuring that AAA activities are consistent with federal requirements. An important note is that state oversight relates to AAAs who do business as AAAs. Some entities with the AAA designation also do other work, not as a AAA. The only time that the state needs information about non-AAA activities, so to speak, is if those activities present a conflict of interest or would otherwise impact the AAA's ability to comply with federal requirements. So with that lengthy background, we'll go to the next slide. So I want to start by walking through the sample SUA policy, procedure, and submission form. As we posted in the chat, this is on our website and will be distributed to all registered attendees after this webinar. You can find the sample starting at page 11 of the document as part of Appendix A. Unlike some of our other Back to Basics webinars, rather than walk through the regulatory language first, I wanted to start with the most user-friendly documents that we put together to help SUAs and AAAs implement this provision. First, we'll take a look at the sample policy and form, and then we'll look at the guidance we published, and then we will finally finish with the regulatory provision. Next slide, please. So in the next few slides, as I mentioned, I will walk you through a sample of an SUA policy and procedure related to contracts and commercial relationships. Again, I want to reiterate, these are not required documents for SUAs to adopt. They are examples of how an SUA might, in consultation with AAAs, decide to implement this provision. As you'll see, this imaginary SUA has decided to categorically approve establishment of certain kinds of agreements that seem low risk to the state. And by categorically approve, I mean approve after receiving the minimum information required from AAAs. For other kinds of agreements, the SUA asks AAAs to fill out a risk screening checklist for the state to review before providing approval. Throughout the sample policy and procedures, you'll see blue text, which explains more about each section of the policy and explores alternatives the SUA could consider. Next slide, please. So here's the sample policy. The SUA encourages AAAs to establish comprehensive and coordinated systems for supportive, nutrition, and other services for older adults in our state by leveraging resources beyond OAA funding. In doing so, AAAs can use both government and private funding to serve more older adults in need. Through this policy, the SUA intends to facilitate increased access to aging services in our state while ensuring responsible oversight of federal funds and protecting the integrity of our aging services network. Consistent with Section 212 of the Older Americans Act, AAAs who seek to establish agreements to serve individuals or entities not otherwise receiving services under the Act must obtain prior approval from the SUA. This policy applies to agreements with any entity, both for-profit and nonprofit, for a AAA to provide goods or services in exchange for reimbursement or other financial consideration, with the expectation that the agreement will result in profit and reimbursement of initial costs. Some key elements of this that I want to highlight for you. The intent of Section 212 broadly is to encourage these activities while ensuring responsible oversight of federal funds and to protect the integrity of the aging services network. And the state has chosen to reiterate in its policy. The state directly incorporates Section 212 language in the form of provide services to individuals or entities not otherwise receiving services, which is directly from the statute, and the state reminds AAAs that prior approval is required. This policy clarifies that AAAs can engage in these agreements with both profits or for-profit and nonprofit companies, which is also outlined in our final rule and required by the Act. And I will say again that although this is not explicitly noted in the sample policy, state prior approval does not generally entail review of contract documents. We will discuss this in more depth when we discuss the guidance. Next slide, please. So the sample policy continues. For agreements involving multiple AAAs, one entity may submit information for prior approval on behalf of the group. The anticipated contractual expectations of each AAA must be clear in the information submitted. Service providers subcontracted for work to execute an approved agreement are not required to separately seek prior approval. AAAs must incorporate standard language related to conflicts of interest and compliance with SUA data use policies into each of the prospective agreements for which they are seeking approval. The SUA has established this streamlined policy and procedure to expedite the prior approval process as much as possible. Note on use of Older Americans Act funding. Consistent with Section 212 of the Older Americans Act, AAAs may use OAA funding to develop or initiate Section 212 agreements. All Section 212 agreements must incorporate a guarantee that any OAA cost used in development will be reimbursed to the AAA by the third party. In addition, the Older American Act requires that any amount of payment to the AAA that exceeds this initial reimbursement will be used to provide or to support the provision of Older Americans Act services. Key elements. This policy seeks to address a frequently asked question about AAAs operating cooperatively and how states can handle approval for those kinds of arrangements. The SUA also requires incorporation of conflicts of interest policies and data use policies into each 212 agreement. We hope at some point in the near future to provide tools to help address conflicts of interest. The state would have broad discretion here to add other concerns. The state is invested in ensuring prior approval is as expedited as possible. That's clear from this policy. We believe that's clearly the intent of the Old Americans Act. And it incorporates Section 212 requirements related to reimbursing Old Americans Act costs and the requirements that profits be reinvested. Note, the requirement of reinvestment applies to all 212 agreements, whether or not Old Americans Act costs were involved in developing the agreement. Next slide, please. The sample policy continues to review types of agreements that can be approved through this policy. So through this policy, the SUA categorically pre-approves the following types of agreements, contingent on receipt of the minimum information outlined in the prior approval form. So the state will categorically approve agreements with local, state, and federal governmental entities, agreements with other AAAs or AAA associations, and agreements with entities with which a AAA has a long-standing existing business relationship of 3 years or more. And then AAAs that have received an audit report with financial findings within the previous 12 months are not eligible in this state for categorical approval of agreements. Instead, AAAs in such situations must complete the entire form, which we will review for SUA review for each agreement for which they're seeking approval. And then the blue text reads, the SUA, in consultation with AAAs, may decide to offer blanket prior approval for categories of contracts and commercial relationships that pose, in the state's opinion, very little risk, such as those listed above. Of course, there'll be a wide variation in whether a state considers any of these categories to be low risk. The SUA also always retains the ability to audit or request supporting documentation if concerns arise. In addition to categorical approval, the state might decide to offer a review and approval process for distinct categories of contracts and commercial relationships, such as those listed in the next slide. In all cases, SUAs must still receive minimum information about the contracts and commercial relationships prior to their establishment. So, a few key elements about this slide. The SUA made the decision to categorically approve 3 types of agreements. I use type not as a term of art, that's just a way of saying a certain kind of agreement. AAAs, except for AAAs that have received an audit report with financial findings in the past 12 months, only need to submit to the state minimum information, which is discussed in the guidance and the form to the state. Once the AAA has submitted the information to the state, they can consider the agreements approved upon submission. SUAs have very broad discretion here to determine what and whether to categorically approve different kinds of agreements. This state decided to categorically approve certain agreements and to do a closer review and risk screening process of other agreements, as you'll see on the next slide. Next slide, please. The SUA will also approve the following types of agreements subject to review of the required prior approval forms. They'll approve a single agreement with an entity or multiple entities to provide specific services. An example of this would be an agreement with a health plan for a AAA to provide meals to individuals identified by that plan. They will review and approve a category or a type of agreement with a specific entity or type of entity for the AAAs to provide specific services, including through private pay arrangements. That could look like agreements to provide home delivered meals to individuals and/or any health plan generally. And finally, they'll approve a type of agreement with a type of entity or multiple entities for the AAA to provide a broad category of services. So on the spectrum of approving a single agreement to approving a very broad sort of group of agreements, an example of this would be the state will approve a AAA's ability to enter into agreements to provide a broad category of services to clients of hospitals and hospital systems generally. So the key distinction between these categories and those listed on the previous slide is that the SUA has decided that it needs to review information submitted by AAAs prior to approval of these agreements. Whereas for agreements that are categorically approved under this policy, the SUA need only receive information from the AAA. Key element. For agreements that require closer review, the SUA still has provided a broad range of options to AAAs. The state might review anything from a single agreement with a single entity to a broad category of agreements that AAAs might want to enter into. Next slide. The policy continues to discuss the prior approval procedure. So AAAs must submit the following information for any new potential agreements that require prior approval. AAAs may submit the prior approval form whenever necessary to receive approval prior to establishing an agreement subject to prior approval under Section 212 of the Old Americans Act. So this is the minimum information that the state requires to be submitted. The name of or type of the entity with which it intends to establish agreements, the nature of the agreement, including the specific service or the types of services to be provided under the agreement, an estimate of the proposed costs incurred from all sources, including the estimated amount of Old Americans Act and state funds that will be used in implementing the agreement, the duration of the agreement, the completed risk screening form, and signed assurances. So the blue text note instructs that items in 1, 2, and 3 are the minimum information that an SUA must receive to provide prior approval of an agreement under Section 212. So from our perspective, you have to collect these 3 elements of information. The SUA may request additional information, for example, the items in blue text on this slide, duration, completed risk screening, and signed assurances. Whether or not the SUA requires AAAs to provide risk screening information or sign the assurances provided in this example guidance, AAAs have ongoing obligations under the Old Americans Act to identify and address conflicts of interest and must operate consistent with the assurances in Section 212, Section 306, and elsewhere in the Act. SUAs have the discretion to determine whether to incorporate these requirements into the prior approval process to reinforce the ongoing underlying obligations associated with all AAA activities, and as a means of assessing the risk of any given agreement that requires prior approval. Then one key element to note, under the Old Americans Act, states statutorily have to receive all relevant documents, including information about all costs incurred, prior to being able to approve a 212 agreement. In this sample, we lay out the scope of what we believe all relevant documents broadly means, and we clarify that costs incurred is an estimate because it's a prospective approval. Next slide. So after prior approval, the state policy lays out their risk screening process and outlines the assurances that they'd like a AAA to sign. So risk screening. AAAs must assess prospective agreements for risk according to the criteria identified in this policy. If one or more of the identified risks are present, the SUA will not approve without discussion or with discussion with or the provision of further information from the AAA. The blue text. The SUA, in consultation with AAAs, might decide to require AAAs to provide additional information when specific risks are identified. The SUA might alternatively decide not to assess specific risks at all. The scenarios in this policy are examples of potential risks that may lead SUAs to review a potential agreement more closely. SUAs should adapt any risk screening to the specific needs of their state. SUAs could also decide not to incorporate these specific criteria into their policy and instead only list them in the prior approval form. Assurances. AAAs must provide assurances of compliance with certain requirements under the Act, which are listed in the prior approval form. AAAs must also incorporate standard language related to conflicts of interest into each of the prospective agreements for which they're seeking approval. So again, that black text is part of the sample policy. Now we see here blue text sort of explaining the alternatives the state might consider or providing further explanatory text. So as with risk screening, the SUA has discretion to decide whether to require assurances specific to each agreement as part of the prior approval process. Regardless, AAAs have ongoing obligations under the Old Americans Act to identify and address conflicts of interest and must operate consistent with the assurances in Section 306 and throughout the Act. A couple of key elements I just want to flag on this slide. I won't review all the risk screening criteria in this webinar, but I encourage you to take a look at the sample policy that we published. I want to reiterate that this is fully customizable And if a state chose to incorporate this kind of a screening into its policy, they would decide which situations represent a risk in that state. And I think the question of risk is really foundational when thinking about the state oversight rule for Section 212 and the requirement of prior approval. So as a matter of policy, the Older Americans Act encourages the establishment of these kinds of agreements in pursuit of helping increase the number of older adults who have access to services. States are put in the position of asking themselves, why would we not approve this agreement? And one way of answering that question is to ask, what risk does it present to clients, to the AAA, to the network, or to the state? What is the potential for harm, and what is the likelihood of the worst case scenario? It's important for states to remember that the prior approval process is not the only opportunity to engage in oversight. And so when we include these risk screening criteria in this policy, none of them is intended to be a reason definitively that an agreement will not be approved. It's a reason for discussion between the AAA and the state. Next slide, please. So that's the policy. And the next couple of slides are a review of the actual sample prior approval submission form that we published. As with the policy, I'll give a review of the content of the form, and I'll highlight some key considerations and alternative decisions that a state could make. For the sake of publication, this is formatted as if AAAs actually have to fill out a physical form, but states could format this however they liked, so long as it's accessible to AAAs. Anything from an email to the state with the required information, to a web portal with fillable fields, to a faxed piece of paper. This is up to the state's discretion in consultation with AAAs. So, to fill out the submission form for this imaginary state for prior approval, the sample form requires contact information, information about the prospective agreement, the name or type of entity or entities, and if a non-disclosure agreement prevents you from disclosing the name, it asks you to disclose the type. You have to disclose the specific services or the kinds of services, categories of services to be provided. You indicate whether multiple AAAs have contractual obligations under this agreement, and if yes, you identify them and describe their obligations. You indicate whether Older Americans Act funds or resources, including administrative overhead, data systems, staffing, etc., will be used in implementing the agreement, and if yes, estimate Older Americans Act costs, and estimate total costs incurred. And that's it. As you'll see on the next slide, this is the minimum information that the state is requiring for submission for agreements that can be categorically approved, and it could take 5 minutes or less to fill out. Next slide. So the rest of the form is divided into 4 approval criteria. First, we'll discuss categorically approved agreements. Then there's the risk screening for agreements that aren't categorically approved. There's a section on assurances and a section for signatures. So first, we'll talk about categorically approved agreements. Pre-approved categories of agreements. The AAA is asked to indicate, is this a proposed agreement, or are these proposed agreements with the local, state, or federal governmental entity, with other AAAs or AAA associations, with an entity or entities with which the AAA has a long-standing existing business relationship of 3 years or more. Then if a AAA checked any of the items in number 1, they just skip to number 3 to review the assurances and provide a signature. No additional SCA review is required. These categories of agreements are considered approved upon submission of this form. So because once they've submitted this form, the state has received the minimum information required, the state is categorically approving the agreement. This includes the caveat below that AAAs in this state that have received an audit report with financial findings within the previous 12 months are not eligible for the categorical approval of agreements. This does not mean that they are not eligible for 212 agreements. It means that they have to complete the form, the entire form for each agreement, and submit it to the SUA for review and approval. Next slide, please. So, the form instructs AAAs, assuming that this is an agreement that is not categorically approved, to screen the proposed agreements for a list of risks that the SUA has identified. It reads, to assess for any potential risks associated with the proposed agreements, please checkmark any of the potential risks listed that are relevant to this application for prior approval. Please provide an attachment describing for each potential risk that has been checked, either why the AAA does not believe the criteria presents a risk in the case of the proposed agreement, or how the AAA intends to mitigate any actual risk. The SUA may request further discussion or documentation prior to making a final determination about the agreements. The blue text, the SUA could choose from a wide range of options in assessing the risk associated with agreements. The SUA could choose to ask for disclosure and propose mitigation plans, could also decide to ask for attestations that any potential risks have been identified and mitigated. And as mentioned, could also decide not to undergo a risk screening as part of their prior approval process. Next slide, please. This slide includes a small example of potential risks. Again, I encourage you to look at the sub-regulatory guidance that we've published, which has about 2/3 of a page listing potential risks. But here are some. The AAA does not have an approved area plan. The AAA is on a corrective action plan or has received notice of being out of compliance with this area plan and is in the process of entering into a corrective action plan. The AAA has had carryover of Older Americans Act funding exceeding the SUA's policy and/or reallotment of funds within the last 3 fiscal years. There is current or pending litigation involving the AAA, and there are conflicts of interest involving the AAA that have not been removed or remedied. And then, as the form then indicates, if a AAA checks any of the risks identified by the state, they'll submit the form to the state with accompanying information, and the SUA might or might not be in touch for further discussion. I mentioned this above, but I'll just reiterate because I think it's important to highlight the risks identified here are not de facto reasons that the state won't approve of an agreement. They all represent the potential for a risk that the state may want to discuss. The state likely wants to make sure that conflicts of interest are mitigated. They might want to make sure that appropriate insurance policies are in place. The policy asks the AAA to submit an attachment describing why they do not see a risk or how they're mitigating the risk. We want to encourage states to be specific and thoughtful about the potential harm they're trying to avoid as they're working with AAAs to get to a yes and be able to approve an agreement. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about assurances and signatures. These are the last 2 sections of the form. In the interest of time and space, I haven't included the specific assurances here, but I'll just share the categories of assurances, most of which stem directly from statutory requirements. So we include individual and organizational conflicts of interest, assurances that are specific to Section 212 requirements, Section 306, which is broadly the requirements associated with being a AAA. Specifically, 306A13 is an annual information disclosure required by law. And we also added compliance with SUA data use policies, including confidentiality and HIPAA compliance. The last assurance is not explicitly an Older Americans Act requirement, but we include it because A, we think it's good policy, and B, to demonstrate that the state has discretion to decide which assurances, if any, to require as part of the submission process. And I also just will say again that whether or not a state requires AAAs to provide attestations or assurances as part of this prior approval process, the AAA still has underlying legal obligations related to all of the assurances here. So for example, whether or not a state reminds AAAs of their potential obligations under HIPAA, they apply. So this might be a good opportunity to just make sure all parties are on the same page about those obligations. And finally, the form provides space for the AAA to sign and for other AAAs involved in the agreement to sign as well. A lead entity may submit the form on behalf of all AAAs involved, but the state needs to ensure that all other AAAs have consented. The state has discretion about how to make that determination. So, as with all components of this sample form, we encourage states to adapt and not adopt. And it's completely possible and actually expected that states may have totally different approaches to their policies and procedures that are still in compliance with federal requirements. So again, these are only sample policies and procedures. Please use them only if they are useful to you in developing compliant policies and procedures. So that concludes the review of the sample policy and guidance. We're going to pivot now to walk through the guidance that accompanies the sample policy and the form that we just reviewed. This guidance provides many examples and is hopefully a relatively user-friendly discussion of this policy area. For those of you following along with the document at the link we provided, we will start at page 1. And I'm going to editorialize momentarily to say, we are so looking forward to discussions with you about these documents and know that they hopefully answer some questions and likely raise many more. So, defining contracts and commercial relationships. I've mentioned this in my background information, but in the 2024 Old Americans Act final rule, we use the term contract or commercial relationship consistently as a broadly encompassing phrase, whether they're contracts, business arrangements, agreements, business transactions, or any other term that an organization might use to describe a business arrangement between one or more entities. It is broadly encompassed within the statutory term contracts or commercial relationships. And when we're not referring to all contracts and commercial relationships, we explain which subset is relevant. For example, Section 212 agreements refers to agreements authorized by Section 212 of the Act. Next slide. State approval of AAA activities. As recipients of federal funding under the Old Americans Act, state units on aging ultimately bear responsibility for determining whether AAAs, as the designated subrecipients of federal funding, comply with federal requirements. Beyond general oversight responsibilities, the Old Americans Act establishes two mechanisms for SUAs to provide advance approval of AAA activities. First, SUAs must develop a policy and procedure or process for approving Section 212 agreements. This process must be readily available for AAAs seeking approval for activities. Opportunities related to Section 212 may arise outside of standard area plan timeframes, and requests for prior approval do not need to meet the same expectations for public input, advisory council review, and other area plan requirements. AAAs can only successfully establish contracts and commercial relationships that require prior approval if SUAs can approve of them in a timely fashion. Second, in addition to an approval process specific to Section 212 agreements, we also encourage SUAs to incorporate approval of Section 212 agreements into the area plan approval process. The area plan approval process is described in Section 306A of the Act. Area plans describe the AAA's plans to facilitate the provision of Old Americans Act services during a specific time frame within a planning and service area. Once the SUA approves the area plan, the AAA can then establish agreements with service providers to achieve the goals laid out in the area plan during the approved period. In order to incorporate Section 212 approval into the area plan process, SUAs would need to collect certain minimum information about prospective Section 212 agreements, which we discuss elsewhere in this guidance and which we reviewed in the sample form. Next slide, please. To help you sort of understand how we see the relationship between Section 212 and the area plan process, we include this table in the guidance that we published today. So this chart describes the similarities and differences between the requirements for area plan approval and the requirements for prior approval of Section 212 agreements under the Act. Prior approval. Both processes require advance approval of activities. For Section 212, if AAAs want to enter into Section 212 agreements, which they can or cannot do, they must receive prior approval from the state. Through Section 212, AAAs may support a single activity or a category of activities through contracts with other entities. Old Americans Act funding may or may not be involved in these agreements. For the area plan, again, AAAs must receive prior approval through the area plan to use Old Americans Act funding to support a category of activities through contracts with service providers. Obviously, the content of the services to be provided are different, and under the area plan, we're primarily talking about Old Americans Act Title III services, or solely talking about that. Section 212 permits you to expand beyond the Old Americans Act Title III services. Providing direct services. For Section 212, after receiving prior approval for Section 212 agreements, AAAs may directly provide services. Similar to the area plan, in order to provide direct services, AAAs need approval from the state to directly provide Title III services. There are differences when it comes to frequency of approval. The prior approval process for Section 212 should be available at any time. The area plan process occurs every 2 to 4 years as determined by the SUA, with annual updates and adjustments as needed. There are also differences when it comes to public input. Section 212 does not require public input or advisory council review, but approval of the area plan does require public input and advisory council review. Next slide. There are also differences when it comes to which information needs to be disclosed. So for Section 212 agreements, there's minimum information that we've discussed that needs to be disclosed, but you'll note that the identity of the specific entity is not a requirement. The area plan requirement requires annual disclosure of the identity of all entities with which the AAA has contracts or commercial relationships to provide services to older adults. I'll note that this disclosure requirement applies to Section 212 agreements as well. And I just want to dig into this a little bit further by saying a AAA might get prior approval for a 212 agreement without disclosing the specific organization that they're contracting with. But because of the annual disclosure agreement, ultimately on an annual basis, they'll be required to disclose the identity after the establishment. Okay, minimum information required for approval. We've already reviewed this. Section 212 requires the disclosure of specific minimum information, the name or type, the nature of the agreement, and the estimate of the proposed costs being incurred. And then this information would need to be incorporated into the area plan process in order to use that process to approve of Section 212 agreements. And for the area plan, typically state units on aging are approving general activities rather than approving of specific contracts or agreements to facilitate the provision of Title III services. So as we just discussed, in terms of the annual disclosure requirement under an area plan, the disclosure of any specific information related to an agreement is generally going to occur after the agreement has been established, to be distinguished from Section 212, where it happens before. Hopefully that's helpful to you in understanding the two processes. We're going to go to the next slide and talk more about the meat of this guidance, which is which agreements require prior approval. So Section 212 of the Old Americans Act permits AAAs to enter into an agreement, and this is a statutory phrase, to provide services to individuals or entities not otherwise receiving services under this act, subject to a number of conditions. One of the conditions to approval is the requirement that the AAA receive prior approval from the SCUA before entering into the agreement. An important note here, Section 212 applies equally to contracts and commercial relationships executed with and without Old Americans Act resources. The phrase provide services to individuals or entities not otherwise receiving services under this act is important and potentially confusing. 212 agreements are agreements to do this thing, to provide services to individuals or entities not otherwise receiving services under this act. And SUAs are ultimately responsible for determining whether an agreement is a Section 212 agreement and therefore requires prior approval. So the next several slides and the next few pages of this guidance are all focused on helping states and AAAs understand when an agreement is a Section 212 agreement. Next slide, please. So in our guidance, we provide 3 guiding questions to help you determine when an agreement requires prior approval. What is the funding source? Who are the clients that will be served? And how is the AAA determining who's eligible for them? And what are the services being provided? The first question is really dispositive. It's the most important. The other 2 are helpful to address some frequently asked questions that we've gotten, and they provide a different way of looking at the issue. But ultimately, this comes down to a question of the funding source. So if the AAA is considering an agreement that relies on non-Old Americans Act funding, other than funding that's used for the Old Americans Act match, which is approved as part of the area plan, it's a Section 212 agreement. Next slide. So question 1, what's the funding source? Non-Old Americans Act funding. An agreement is subject to prior approval under Section 212 if a AAA is receiving a non-OAA source of funding to provide or facilitate the provision of services. We have a number of examples in the guidance. So, for example, a AAA seeks to provide home-delivered meals through a contract with funding from a local hospital system or health plan. Requires prior approval. A AAA seeks to provide direct services under private pay arrangements. In both of these examples, the AAA is seeking to provide direct services in return for reimbursement from non-Old Americans Act funding, and the agreements require prior approval. Let's look at if Old Americans Act funding is used. An agreement is not subject to prior approval under Section 212 if a AAA is using Old Americans Act funding to pay another entity, for example, a service provider, to provide Older Americans Act services to Older Americans Act clients in accordance with its area plan. This is hopefully self-evident, but we thought it would be helpful to contrast. So examples of this. The AAA provides transportation services with Older Americans Act and other matching funding to clients in its planning and service area by contracting with a transportation service provider. Another example, a AAA is a direct service provider of home delivered meals using Older Americans Act funding. AAA establishes agreements with service providers to help support its home delivered meals program. In both of these examples, AAA's activities are already approved under the area plan. They are not Section 212 agreements. They rely on Older Americans Act funding. An agreement is also not subject to prior approval under Section 212 if a AAA is using Older Americans Act funding to pay an entity to meet the administrative needs necessary to enable the AAA to fulfill its obligations under the Older Americans Act. So, for example, the AAA has contracts for utility, janitorial, and other services for the AAA's primary office building. These agreements are required for AAA to fulfill its responsibilities under the area plan. They are not Section 212 agreements and do not require prior approval. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at question 2. Who are the clients that will be served through the agreement, and how is the AAA who is determining who is eligible for these services? So if the clients who benefit from an agreement would be identified by another entity, either specifically or based on specific criteria, it's a Section 212 agreement. Let's look at how that might work. If the AAA is arranging for services to be provided to a different group of clients than the clients served by their Title III Older Americans Act services, the agreement is subject to prior approval under Section 212. Example, a AAA makes home-delivered meals available to older adults through Title III funding. They have enough capacity to make additional home-delivered meals available to participants in a Medicare Advantage plan who need time-limited assistance. The plan seeks to contract with a AAA for home-delivered meals for clients identified by the plan. In this example, the AAA must receive prior approval before entering the contract. In theory, these could be clients who could have received home-delivered meals as part of the Title III services. But the Medicare Advantage plan here is specifically deciding who receives meals and when. The AAA has nothing to say about whether they're eligible, and even if the AAA had a waitlist for Title III services, these clients would still receive services through the agreement. Okay, let's look at another example where the prospective clients are actually already existing Older Americans Act clients. So, example, the AAA provides caregiver support services to eligible individuals under the Act. A subset of individuals receiving those services are also members of a local health plan. The health plan seeks to reimburse the AAA for providing caregiver support to that subset of AAA clients. So one way to think about this is that the clients are able to jump the line for services because a new source of funding guarantees their service. The Older Americans Act requires that AAAs provide Title III services by doing its own determination of greatest economic and greatest social need and providing services to all clients in the order that they've determined, based solely on that available funding. Next slide, please. So the last question that we pose is, what are the services being provided? Let's look at non-Older Americans Act funded services. If the services are only available to private pay clients or other entities, the agreement is subject to prior approval under Section 212. So, for example, if a AAA seeks to expand its congregate meals program and make medically tailored meals available to private pay clients with diabetes and cardiovascular conditions and other health needs, or to sell those meals to other entities on their behalf, prior approval is required. In this example, the private pay program requires prior approval under Section 212 because these medically tailored meals would not otherwise be available as part of the congregate meals program due to funding constraints, and individuals would not otherwise be able to receive these services. However, just a note on private pay programs in general, the AAA only needs to seek approval for the whole private pay scheme and not for each individual transaction. If the AAA is providing or facilitating the provision of allowable Older Americans Act services, to individuals who do not meet the eligibility requirements under the Act, that agreement is also subject to prior approval under Section 212. So, for example, a AAA provides care coordination to eligible adults age 60 and older and family caregivers using Older Americans Act funding consistent with its approved area plan. The AAA also wants to provide this service for a fee to individuals seeking services who do not meet Older Americans Act eligibility requirements, for example, individuals under age 60. In this example, the AAA would seek prior approval under Section 212 for the program. Let's look at how that functions using Older Americans Act funds. So if the AAA is providing or facilitating the provision of allowable Older Americans Act services and making them available through Older Americans Act funds to individuals that meet the eligibility requirements under the Act, bread and butter, that agreement is not subject to prior approval under Section 212. So, for example, a AAA provides physical activity classes to adults age 60 and older using Older Americans Act funding consistent with its area plan. In this example, Section 212 obviously does not require prior approval for any arrangement to provide new or different physical activity classes with the same attendee criteria. Other SUA policies and procedures regarding Older Americans Act funded activities would apply. Next slide, please. We include information in this guidance that is responsive to some frequently asked questions we've gotten. Here are two. AAAs must receive prior approval from the SUA to establish agreements between a AAA and another entity or type of entity for Section 212 agreements. After receiving approval, we expect, as a matter of executing that agreement, that the AAA will also contract with service providers to fulfill its obligations. Only the AAA needs to seek prior approval in such an arrangement. The service provider does not need to seek approval from the state. Another question we get frequently, a group of AAAs may also collaborate as part of a larger arrangement, usually through a community care hub, for example, with one lead AAA primarily engaging with a third-party funder. In this case, at the discretion of the SUA, the AAAs could collectively seek prior approval so long as the specific actions being taken by each AAA and the consent of each AAA to participate in the arrangement are clearly laid out. Next slide, please. SUAs have the discretion to extend the opportunities and obligations available under Section 212 of the Act for agreements with for-profit entities to agreements with nonprofit entities. In other words, if an agreement would be permitted under Section 212 with a for-profit entity, an SUA could determine that a similar agreement with a nonprofit entity is also permissible so long as the other requirements of Section 212 are met. We encourage SUAs to take this approach to expand services and supports, or otherwise to explain why they decline to do so in their policies and procedures. Just to note, this is like a strange legal artifact. We include this in the guidance because the statute specifically permits these kind of activities with profit-making organizations, which is interpreted as for-profits. But because it is also an allowable activity for AAAs to contract with nonprofits, it is allowable so long as the state permits it in the policies and procedures. So if a state wants to make sure that 212 agreements are available for for-profits and nonprofit contracts, the state should include language to this effect in their policy. Next, and I think possibly the last, or one of the last slides for me, Section 212 permits AAAs to use Older Americans Act funds in a way that would not otherwise be allowable. AAA can use Older Americans Act funding to help support or develop an initiative that will then be supported by another funding source. If a AAA uses Older Americans Act funds in this way, any Older Americans Act funds must be reimbursed after the agreement becomes profitable, and any subsequent profits must be reinvested in Older Americans Act services. I mentioned this earlier, but Section 212 actually requires that the profits from all 212 agreements be reinvested in Older Americans Act services, not just if Older Americans Act funding is used in the agreement. ACL is available to provide technical assistance to assist SUAs in supporting these initiatives. In understanding what costs qualify as Older Americans Act funding, it's also important to quantify and reimburse other kinds of Older Americans Act supported resources that were used to contribute to the new initiative. Some commonly overlooked Older Americans Act funded resources include administrative overhead, the use of Older Americans Act data systems, staffing and training costs that are wholly or partially funded by the Older Americans Act, and access to Older Americans Act client lists. It's important to remember that Section 212 agreements require state unit on aging prior approval, regardless of whether Older Americans Act funding is used to support them or not. Okay, next slide. Some state considerations as they develop prior approval processes. If you read the preamble to our final rule, good reading, this should all be familiar. State unit on aging oversight policies and procedures should be streamlined, transparent, not overly burdensome to either the SUA or AAAs, and commensurate to the degree of risk associated with a specific agreement. In developing their policies and procedures, SUAs should consider the relevant government interests associated with reviewing a potential agreement. This includes, among others, any potential conflicts of interest and whether appropriate firewalls exist to mitigate them, if the AAA is meeting existing obligations under the Older Americans Act, and potential risks to the AAA, the Aging Services Network, or to the individuals served by the AAA associated with the proposed agreement. Next slide, please. A little bit more on state considerations. Section 306A of the Act sets forth many relevant government interests in the form of assurances that AAAs must offer for the area plan to be approved. SUAs might consider incorporating these assurances into their prior approval processes, which is what we saw in the sample form that we looked at, in addition to the requirements laid out in Section 212B of the Act. SUAs are not parties to Section 212 agreements. However, they are responsible for receiving sufficient information to approve of certain contracts and commercial relationships consistent with Sections 305, 306, and 212 of the Act. SUAs are also responsible for ensuring that the use of federal funds is reasonable and allocable, consistent with 45 CFR Part 75, which is the federal grants rule, or the HHS grants rule. Engaging in these responsibilities does not make the SUA a party to the contract or commercial relationship under review. Although state units on aging have the discretion to request to review contract documents if they deem it necessary to determine whether the contract or commercial relationship may be approved, it should generally not be necessary to do so. As we state in the final rule, we expect SUA approval processes to be flexible, reflecting the needs of the older individuals served and the abilities of AAAs to engage in contracts and commercial relationships. We remind SUAs that the regulatory provision 1321.9 C214C requires policies and procedures that permit AAAs to receive approval to establish contracts and commercial relationships. It does not require review of contract documents in order to provide that approval. The SUA, as the direct recipient of Older Americans Act funding, always has the ability to engage in oversight for subrecipients, including the ability to audit or request supporting documentation if concerns arise, and to take remedial steps as appropriate. Consequently, SUAs should not view the 212 prior approval process as their only opportunity to course correct, and the prior approval process should not be unnecessarily burdensome. Next slide, please. We've reviewed this information before. I'll say it again. The guidance lays out the minimum information that SUAs must receive from AAAs in order to approve an agreement, the name or type of an entity, the nature of the agreement, information about specific or estimated costs, and we add specific assurances related to 212. SUAs have the discretion to determine whether a contract amendment materially alters an agreement in a way that requires new approval from the state. And the SUA can determine that unless the amendment revises the minimum information, no new review is required. Full state discretion. Beyond that minimum information, we outlined several potential policies in the 2024 final rule that SUAs might adapt or adopt. For example, an SUA could adopt standard assurances related to conflicts of interest to be included in all AAA agreements to provide services, and they could decide not to review case-by-case information related to conflicts of interest outside of periodic monitoring. An SUA could pre-approve a AAA to engage in a general category of contracts and commercial relationships with certain types of organization, subject to certain conditions and a commitment to provide information as required under 306A. And finally, we strongly encourage SUAs to seek input on proposed approval processes from AAAs to help achieve a balanced and feasible approach that will support the goal of minimizing risks while enabling the expansion of services to reach older adults with unmet needs. This is my final slide. So we'll talk about oversight, liability, and addressing challenges. So many SUAs and AAAs have asked questions about the scope of state liability in the event of an issue related to Section 212 agreement. Every situation is unique and cannot give definitive answers that address specific circumstances through general guidance. However, it's important to remember that an issue with a Section 212 agreement will not necessarily result in disallowed costs or financial harm to the state. The SUA must establish and follow policies and procedures that are compliant with the 2024 final rule and that comply with any other applicable requirements for recipients of federal grants. If the SUA has compliant policies that address fiscal and programmatic control issues and abides by other applicable federal grant requirements and otherwise acts in good faith, Section 212 agreements that do not successfully result in reimbursement of Older Americans Act funds may still be considered an allowable cost under the grant. The structure of the Older Americans Act is such that SUAs, as federal grantees, are ultimately responsible for ensuring the appropriate use of funds, while AAA subrecipients are predominantly responsible for using those funds to develop the aging services network. This framework may lead SUAs to err on the side of caution, which is appropriate in overseeing the use of federal funds, so as to not be held responsible for risky subrecipient activities. However, too much caution in this area may inhibit the provision of vital services and the sustainable growth of the network at a time when there's a growing population of older adults and greater demand for services. Sections 212 and 306G highlight the importance of leveraging existing knowledge, expertise, and relationships to expand the reach of the aging services network. All new business endeavors represent some degree of risk. The policies and procedures required by the 2024 rule are intended to help mitigate and not eliminate that risk. The intent of sections 212 and 306G can only be realized if the full financial risk of the potential failure of new contracts and commercial relationships does not fall on SUAs. For this reason, we clarified in the 2024 final rule that activities under section 212 are allowable costs so long as they comply with SUA policies and procedures. SUAs have a range of options available to them to address challenges with subgrantees. In addition to other oversight activities, the SUA can offer to provide technical assistance to AAA to explain what would be necessary for the SUA to approve a specific agreement, including discussing any acceptable firewalls or other remedies for conflicts of interest that might be required. In rare circumstances, the SUA might determine that no remedy is available that could mitigate the risks associated with a specific agreement. The SUA's determination will be final. With all of that, I will now pass the presentation over to my colleague, Rhonda Schwartz.
Thanks so much, Elliot. Appreciate that introduction. As Elliot mentioned, I am Rhonda Schwartz. I am a regional administrator with ACL in our Center for Regional Operations. I am a 61-year-old white woman with salt and pepper shoulder-length curly hair, and I'm wearing a multicolored jacket today. It's black, white, and blue with a dark gray top. And we're going to now review general information on the OAA final rule. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on some provisions related to contracts and commercial relationships. So let's go forward to the next slide. Just again, as a reminder, and we've said this before, and we'll say it many, many more times, while the rule is currently effective, we are providing an extended implementation timeframe until October 1st of 2025. We're providing a lot of technical assistance, and this is the sixth webinar in a series to provide technical assistance to our network. And as we've noted before, and again, we'll note this again, I'm sure many times, it's important to remember that the vast majority of what is included in the final rule are long-established Older Americans Act requirements, reaffirming what is in the statute, prior regulations, or existing policies rather than new requirements. Also, many grantees already have most of these requirements in place. As we discussed in detail during the previous webinar that took place on October 29th, there will also be a collaborative corrective action plan process for states that experience challenges in meeting this timeframe for certain provisions under the final rule. During that October 29th webinar, we went through how this process will work, and that webinar will be posted shortly on our ACL.gov/OAArule webpage. Please reach out to your regional administrator if you have questions about corrective action plans. Next slide. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, talks about the layout of the final rule. For a more detailed orientation to the rule, I encourage you again to visit our regulation webpage where we've posted webinars and other resources. This webpage is also where we will post this presentation as well as a recording of this presentation as it becomes available. Next slide. So Elliot described earlier sample policies and procedures that a state unit on aging might use regarding prior approval of Section 212 agreements. SUAs are required to have these policies and procedures in place. And where does this requirement come from? It originates with the Older Americans Act and also is addressed in the final rule. The SUA is responsible for monitoring the program and financial activities of subrecipients and subgrantees to ensure that grant awards are used for the authorized purposes and in compliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the grant award. The policies and procedures developed by the SUA address how the SUA will do that. And I want to make a very important note. Please make sure you're listening now in case you weren't before. So make sure you're listening. Very important. The designated SUA must develop their policies and procedures in consultation with area agencies on aging, program participants, and other appropriate parties in the state. This is required by Section 1321.9. For example, SUAs and AAAs would want to consult with service providers and Title VI programs who receive Title III funds in order to have policies and procedures that are feasible and understandable. So again, we're not intending that the SUA on its own is going to develop these policies and then just hand them to AAAs. We are expecting that the SUAs are going to be consulting with the area agencies and others in the development of these policies. AAAs likewise are required to develop policies and procedures in compliance with SUA policies and procedures, including those under Section 1321.9 and those related to conflicts of interest in consultation with other appropriate parties in the planning and service area. For example, SUAs must have policies and procedures regarding conflicts of interest in accordance with the Act and all other applicable federal requirements. Conflict of interest policies and procedures must establish mechanisms to identify, avoid, remove, and remedy conflicts of interest in a Title III program at organizational and individual levels. SUAs also must have policies and procedures regarding data collection and reporting requirements for direct services provision and more. Next slide. But wait, there's more. I'm not done. The final rule goes one step further and addresses requirements for policies and procedures, in particular with respect to services provided under the Older Americans Act. The AAAs and/or service provider is required to ensure the development and implementation of policies and procedures in accordance with the SUA policies and procedures, again, including those required in 1321.9. The SUA may allow for policies and procedures to be developed by the subrecipients, except for the Ombudsman program and except for cost sharing and where otherwise specified. The AAA and/or service provider will provide the SUA in a timely manner with statistical and other information which the SUA requires to meet its planning, coordination, evaluation, and reporting requirements established by the SUA under Section 1321.9. The SUA and/or AAAs must develop an independent qualitative and quantitative monitoring process ensuring the quality and effectiveness of services regarding meeting participant needs and preferences, the goals described within the state and/or area plan, and state and local requirements, as well as conflicts of interest policies and procedures. Quality monitoring and measurement results are encouraged to be made available to the public in plain language format designed to support and provide information and choice among persons and families receiving services. Next slide. Let's look specifically at the policies and procedures required in the final rule with respect to contracts and commercial relationships. The section which addresses this topic is 1321.9 C214. Under this provision, SUAs must establish processes for AAAs to receive prior approval for contracts and commercial relationships permitted under Section 212 of the Act. We expect such processes to be flexible and streamlined. This provision will help ensure that the activities of recipients and subrecipients of funding further the intended benefits of the Act and do not compromise core responsibilities or the statutory mission of SUAs, AAAs, and service providers. Through these requirements, we intend to promote and expand the ability of the aging network to engage in business activities. So you see what I'm saying here ties right back to what Elliot had been saying throughout his presentation. I'm not going to read the provision here. You can see it. You can go and look at it, and it's here on the slide, but that provision is in there, and that's where CCR is covered. Next slide. Again, I'm not going to go through this and read the provision to you, but you can see it yourselves in the federal rule. And again, it's 1321.9 C214. I do just want to note, as you see on this slide, one of the requirements relating to contracts and commercial relationships is that they have to have policies and procedures meeting conflict of interest requirements. So I just want to point that out. Next slide. So let's go on to conflicts of interest. That's my segue into the conflicts of interest section. I'm just trying to move us along quickly because in the interest of time. So conflicts of interest are mentioned specifically in the final rule in relation to CCR, contracts and commercial relationships. This is going to be a tongue tire for me. There is a reason for this: to ensure that SUAs, AAAs, and service providers carry out the objectives of the Act consistent with the best interests of the older people they serve. It's important to ensure that contracts and commercial relationships do not compromise core Older Americans Act responsibilities. Meeting the conflict of interest requirements set forth by the Act and the OAA final rule assists in ensuring this. So let's look at the definition of conflict of interest. In section 1321.3, it's defined, there are two broad categories defined: one or more conflicts between the private interests and the official responsibilities of a person in a position of trust, and/or one or more conflicts between competing duties of an individual or between the competing duties, services, or programs of an organization and/or a portion of an organization. State units on aging may wish to identify other conflicts of interest based on state law or other requirements. Today, we're going to look at conflicts of interest specific, I should say, to contracts and commercial relationships. This is really like saying a rhyme to me. A future webinar will cover multiple aspects of conflict of interest, such as with legal assistance, the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, AAA boards, and advisory councils. Next slide. Section 1321.47 requires SUAs to have policies and procedures that establish mechanisms to avoid both actual and perceived conflicts of interest and to identify, remove, and remedy any existing conflict of interest at both organizational and individual levels. They include providing a mechanism for informing relevant parties of conflict of interest responsibilities and identifying and addressing conflicts when they arise. For example, a state unit on aging may have specific conflict of interest requirements for providing case management or information and assistance and referral services under the Act. In other instances, an SUA, which also oversees Medicaid managed care programs, may choose to extend their conflict of interest policies in response to relevant Medicaid conflict of interest regulations in a similar way for all roles and services within the state, regardless of funding source. Procedures to mitigate conflict of interest could include establishing firewalls between or among individuals, programs, or organizations involved in the conflict, removing an individual organization from a position, or termination of a contract. Whether the potential conflict of interest is actual or perceived, it is essential that the SUA pursue solutions that preserve the integrity of the mission of the Act. I'm going to say this again because it's important. Whether the potential conflict of interest is actual or perceived, it is essential that the SUA pursue solutions that will preserve the integrity of the mission of the Act. Please also note that Section 307A7B of the Act directs SUAs to include assurances against conflict of interest in their state plans. Next slide. As previously discussed, Section 1321.3 defines conflict of interest, and Section 1321.47 explains the responsibilities of state units on aging to avoid and mitigate conflict of interest. Similarly, Section 1321.67 explains the responsibilities of AAAs to meet the requirements of Section 307A7B of the Act. AAAs must have policies and procedures to identify both organizational and individual conflict of interest. The policies must establish the actions and procedures that AAA will require employees, contractors, grantees, volunteers, and others in a position of trust or authority to take to remedy or remove such conflicts. AAAs have expanded their business activities over the last decade, necessitating additional guidance on preventing and mitigating conflict of interest so they may engage in the new activities and carry out the objectives of the Act. A AAA providing both Older Americans Act and non-Older Americans Act services is not a per se conflict of interest. We recognize that a AAA providing both Older Americans Act and non-Older Americans Act services is an extremely common occurrence and encourage AAAs to develop dynamic and diverse service delivery systems. The conflict of interest standards for AAAs in this final rule apply across organizations, providers, and service relationships. Furthermore, some non-Older Americans Act programs offered by a AAA may be governed by their own conflict of interest rules. For example, the state health insurance program or Medicaid managed care plans. We understand that in smaller communities, the possibility for individual and organizational conflict of interest may be more likely to arise simply by nature of community size and structure. Whether and how actual or potential conflict of interest may be remedied through appropriate policies and procedures is fact-dependent. Factors to consider include whether the individual in question is a decision maker, whether firewalls or other safeguards can be erected between organizations and individuals, and what monitoring protocols are in place for a potentially conflicted situation. Similarly, if a conflict arises, a AAA may ask whether it can be remedied and what the likely impact will be on the quality of services and the credibility of the AAA, its employees, and agents. Next slide. That concludes that discussion of the rule and the conflict of interest topic we wanted to talk about. So now I'm going to provide some closing remarks and cover some resources as well as what you might expect in the coming months. Okay. Here's our timeline. We're striving to provide robust training and technical assistance. We have a thoughtful and organized plan, including roughly monthly webinars for the broad aging network that we will be continuing to roll out over the next year. The rule covers a lot of program areas, so we are breaking the rule down into various topic areas to focus on training the network. Again, much of what is in the final rule is simply reaffirming and better organizing what's in the statute, prior regulations, program instructions, and existing policies. We're working directly with our grantees to implement the rule as well. This means that we will direct AAAs and service providers to work with their grantors, we're talking about the SUA or the AAA, regarding their questions, as the rule requires policies and procedures that the SUAs and AAAs will be responsible for developing and implementing. Again, the compliance date is not until October 1st of 2025, so we have time to do this work, and we have a supportive corrective action plan process if needed. Please view our state plan guidance update and corrective action plan overview webinar slide deck and recording for more information on the corrective action plan process. And now I'm going to just provide some closing remarks and cover some resources again, as well as, oh, did I just go to the wrong slide? I'm not sure. Anyway, I think I'm going backwards. Oh, here I am. OAA final rule resources. Sorry about that. I lost my place. This slide has a link to the final rule as published on February 14th. We also have a web page, which we've mentioned many times, ACL.gov/OAArule, which currently includes the link to our contracts and commercial relationship sub-regulatory guidance with Appendix A, sample policy and form. We also include their webinar information. The recording and slides from today's webinar will be posted in the coming weeks. The recording and slides of the last Back to Basics webinar on nutrition services under Title III, which was held on September 25th, are now also posted there. We have fact sheets there. There currently are 2 general fact sheets, a short 2-pager and a longer expanded 6-page fact sheet to give an overview of the final rule. There also are fact sheets on key topic areas such as fiscal policies and procedures and Title III and VI coordination. We plan to add to this site with additional resources when they are available. In May and June, we posted 2 additional resource materials. One is titled Title III Select Topic Areas to Review for SUAs. The other is titled OAA Regulations 1988 to 2024 Comparison Chart. They can be found under More Resources for Grantees, which is located along the right-hand side of our webpage. We also have information on upcoming webinars and other updates. While we do not have a Back to Basics webinar scheduled for December of this year, we plan to continue having, again, roughly monthly Back to Basics webinars in 2025. So please stay tuned. There's much more to come, such as on topics including emergencies and disasters, conflicts of interest, long-term care ombudsman, legal assistance, and defensive guardianship. And then final slide, please. Thank you for your interest in this webinar on contracts and commercial relationships. We know we covered a lot of information, and we hope the 2024 OAA final rule, as well as our technical assistance, help make the requirements clear regarding planning and development of the state's aging network. Thank you for all you do for older adults and caregivers across America. This concludes today's webinar.